It was Halloween. My mom and dad had gone to an adult Halloween party at their friend's house and left me, a 14-year-old male, and my sister home alone to hand out candy to the neighborhood kids. We lived on a small farm surrounded by other small farms, and Halloweens were pretty mellow. My sister was 12 and had finally gotten to the age where she thought trick-or-treating and dressing up was embarrassing. And I just like staying home and playing video games, my friends, so I didn't usually go out on Halloween. The only issue that night was my parents had forgotten to get candy. So they told us to hand out whatever fruit or pretzels we had in the kitchen. And that was so embarrassing for me, having to give kids something they didn't want on the one night of the year that they were supposed to be getting candy. Wasn't too worried about it, given that not many kids lived in our area. So we figured that we wouldn't have to answer the door much at all. We handed out the first batch of apples to disappointed kids. And by 11 p.m. we assumed that we were done for the night. Then came a knock the door. It was late and I didn't really want to answer the door again. But I figured it was just little kids, and I didn't want to be rude and ignore them when they could see that the lights were on inside. I got to the door and pulled it open and was shocked to see a very tall guy standing there. All in masks, holding their pillowcases open, seemingly expecting candy. "Sorry, guys. We don't have any candy. We've been handing out apples to the kids all night. Might have some pretzels if you want some." But Thomas, one in front, just tilted his head at me, almost like he was confused by what I was saying. But none of them actually spoke. I didn't really know what else to do. So I started to close the door. When I went to shut it all the way, one of the guys would issue between the door and the doorframe to prevent me from closing it. I opened the door again to ask him what his problem was. But instead, and his friends just pushed the way inside. I yelled for my sister to run and hide before being shoved to the ground. One of the intruders pulled out a bat out from under his robe and in a low, deep voice said we didn't come for any candy. I managed to get onto my hands and knees before being kicked in the stomach. Knocked me to the ground once again. I tried screaming. But the thing about living on a farm with more land between you and your neighbors than the average neighborhood is no one is going to hear you scream when you need help. But I kept screaming anyways. It's Halloween. You really think anyone's gonna think twice about a kid screaming? And this made the rest of them laugh behind their masks. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I can give you money if you just leave, please. You don't need to hurt anyone." I expected response. But he just laughed at my shaky voice. And a baby talk voice, one of the guys said, "Oh, look, the little baby scared was daddy to save you when you need them." I felt a stinging at my side as the guy with the bat swung it directly into my ribs. I was trying to listen to the voices to figure out how old they were. And from what I could tell, they seemed young enough to be teenagers. There was a lot of thoughts going through my mind in that moment. I mean, they definitely weren't mature at all. And I called her the corner of the room and pain as they spoke to each other about what rooms that would go in and what they were going to take. One of the guys took me outside while the others looked around the house for whatever it was they wanted. I saw my sister on the roof, hiding outside her window from the man that I could see it just entered her room. The guy that took me outside had me by the collar of my shirt and was leading me toward the barn. He opened the door to the pig pen and pushed me inside. Threatening him with the bat, he made me roll around in the mud and film me as he forced me to OIC. I was terrified, exhausted, confused, embarrassed, and felt completely humiliated at what I was being forced to do. The guy was laughing the whole time too. He told me to get up and let me out of the barn and back inside the house to show the rest of his friends what he'd done to me. And they only just joined in the torment. They made me drink the toilet water, eat trash from the trash can, and other things I can't even speak of as they pulled me around. The whole time I was just hoping they wouldn't find my sister. The strange thing is they hadn't even mentioned her once. They took me to my room and began taking turns, throwing punches. I had no idea what I had done to deserve this horrible beating and torture that I was being put through. I was just going through torture in my mind, and I had no idea. I almost blacked out many times. 10 minutes into the beating, I heard one of them asked me where my sister was. They told me that they wanted to have some fun with her and that they'd stop hurting me if I told them. And this was the moment I decided to stop talking completely. They could hurt me all they wanted. I was not letting them near my sister. They asked me again, spitting my face each time I refused to talk, but there was nothing they could do to me that would get me to give her up. Eventually, they tied me to a chair in the kitchen and just exited the house after thoroughly trashing the place. And I must have blacked out at some point, because when I woke up, I was in the hospital attached to just a bunch of machines. My mom was crying when she noticed me awake and took her time to tell me exactly what happened. It turns out the girl I had just broken up with the week before asked her brother to scare me as revenge for hurting her. I guess he and his friends were just insane for taking it to the extent that they did. I guess they just got caught up in it. As disgusting as that sounds. Thankfully, they were all arrested, but only the brother was actually sentenced some jail time. He received 5 years for aggravated assault and home invasion charges. The other guys got probation as a plea deal for ratting him out. I'm still in a lot of pain since this happened less than a year ago. But I guess there's one thing I tell kids answering the door for Halloween when their parents aren't home. Always check your people first. I'm a cow farmer in the Midwest. It's not the best work, but it is working with how hard it is to find a job with decent pay these days. I've learned to appreciate it. The job entails cleaning up after the cows, checking their hooves, milking, and helping them give birth when necessary. It's a pretty messy job when you look at it from the outside, but I've gotten pretty used to it. I don't even smell the stink anymore like I did when I first started. It used to be almost unbearable, but now really nothing. The farm was my father's before me, and his father's before him. And the story I'm about to tell you is my dad's. He told him to me back when I first started the job as almost what not to do when tending to the animals and working on the farm. His long past now, God rest his soul. But the story has haunted me for years. So I figured I'd let other people hear it and judge it for themselves. This is back in the 60s when Dad was in his early 20s. He worked on the farm with his father Bill at the time. He hated it. He hated the stench that would only get worse in the heat came in the summer, and picking up after the cows was the worst. See, the cows stayed in this huge barn. It was actually more like a big warehouse where they're fed and kept throughout the night. They got to graze during the day. And throughout the night, the cows would defecate and their feces dropped to the concrete floor beneath them. Then in the morning, when the cows will go on to graze, my dad would take a really long hose and spray the droppings to the end of the building down a shaft that leads to a big tank below the barn. The tank would fill with the droppings, and once a week, we had a guy that would come by and empty the tank and dispose of the waste. It was really nasty work, but my dad did it nonetheless. Well, my grandfather decided that was just too much work to do on the farm with just himself and my dad. So they decided to hire another farmhand. They didn't get anyone interested in the job for the first few weeks until they met a man in the local feed store named Fred. He was in his late 20s and eager to work. He hadn't had a job in years and was desperate for pay since his wife was pregnant with their first child. My grandfather hired him right there in that feed store. And by the next day, Fred was on the farm working harder than anyone my dad had ever seen work. He was determined and super ambitious. He was constantly running around the farm fixing stuff that needed fixing and trying to learn absolutely everything it was that they did. He loved the job and told everyone how he just wanted to be good at what he was being paid to do. He believed in good honest work and that people should earn the money they're working for. My dad admitted he loved having Fred around, not just because he worked hard, but also because he was gullible and pretty easily manipulated, I guess. My dad had certain tasks given to him by my grandpa throughout the day. And each time he was told to do something, he just passed that task along to Fred. He didn't mind because he didn't know, and my dad didn't care because it meant less of the work that he hated. About 4 months went by with Fred doing most of the work around the farm, and my dad even started to find it a little funny that he really would do whatever he was told. Without question. He was happy to do it. One hot summer morning the cow I said just gone out to graze, and my grandpa told my dad to spray the droppings down the shaft at the end of the barn like he usually did. My dad then passed the job along to Fred as he sat along the side of the barn to have a smoke. And Fred was done. He came outside to tell my dad that he had an idea that he thought would highly benefit the farm. He told my dad that if he emptied the tank below the barn themselves, they'd be able to use the cow feces as manure in the fields. It would fertilize the plants and make them grow bigger and faster. My dad told me that at first, he thought the idea was stupid. But then he figured it would be funny to see if Fred actually tried and empty that feces tank. So he agreed. It didn't tell my grandpa because he knew he never would have approved, and he just wanted to see how this will play out. A show Fred were to go to the release valve and emptied the tank into the big barrels. He told him to be very careful and to not turn the valve too fast. Otherwise, the line would get clogged and they'd have to call someone to fix it. My dad then left Fred alone to do what he had planned and decided to take a walk around the barn to check the gates and make sure everything was in order. What my dad didn't know at the time was that Fred would end up turning the valve too fast, and the line would end up getting clogged. Fred would then open the tank from above and reach a pole into the sludge to try and dislodge whatever was blocking the line. My dad heard screaming coming from inside the barn and he rushed over to see what was wrong. He made his way down into the tank and was horrified by what he found. Fred had fallen into the huge 5,000-gallon tank that hadn't been emptied for a week and was now drowning in the thick feces, desperately reaching out for help. By the time my dad got to the top of the ladder and looked into the tank, all he could see was Fred's hand poking out of the brown goo. He grabbed onto it and tried pulling them out. But he had no leverage at all on the top of that tank. He managed to pull Fred up long enough for him to tell my dad that he was just trying to fix themselves since he knew that they'd have to pay someone for his mistake. He felt bad. My dad reassured him everything would be okay to just hold on. And that's when his grip failed and Fred plunged back under the thick excrement once again. This time, no part of Fred's body was able to be grabbed onto to possibly rescue him. My dad had no idea what to do. So he ran across the farm as fast as he could to get my grandpa, who immediately called the police. And by the time they made it back to the tank, Fred's hand had disappeared under the sludge. And there was nothing my dad and grandpa could do. But wait. The police showed up with firemen. They didn't know much what to do, either. They ended up reaching a metal pole down into the tank with a sort of loop on the end. And when they pulled Fred out, it was very clear that he had passed. My dad was horrified and felt like it was his fault. He knew it was a bad idea, but thought it would be funny. He could have stopped Fred, but his own arrogance let him do it. Fred's wife became a widow, and she never remarried. She named their son after him and eventually moved out of town. My dad made a point to work as hard as Fred did every day for the rest of his life, in honor of the man whose death he felt he was responsible for. My dad passed away in 2018. And the last thing he said to me was to never take advantage of someone's hard work. It was March 28, 2000. My husband Robert and I had just moved to Fort Worth, Texas from Seattle, Washington. My husband had just gotten a job offer that he was really excited about. In his words, he just couldn't pass it up. He's an architect and the firm he wanted to work at was down there. And I couldn't say no. He was so happy and I was so happy for him. We had 4 children, a 13-year-old boy named Josh, a 10-year-old girl named Jamie, a 7-year-old April, and our youngest 3-year-old girl named Paula. Our kids were super excited. They had heard of cowboys on TV and they kept telling all their friends that they were moving on to a farm with a bunch of animals and that they were going to be farmers. It was really cute. When we first got to our house and the farm, everything was very peaceful. We moved in early March and got mostly settled about 2 weeks later. We didn't have any animals in the farm since we were still in the process of getting into a routine with the kids. Their school was about a 15-minute drive from our house, and we weren't comfortable at the time sending them on the bus. March 28th started out regular, just like every other Tuesday we'd spent in the house thus far. We got the kids ready for school and headed out the door. My husband went to work and I came back with Paul. While she was like a mini-me in every way, follow me everywhere. I adored her and I like to think she adored me. On his way back from work, my husband picked up the kids from school. They got ice cream on the way home and were pretty rowdy up from the sugar rush. When they came inside, I had them do their homework. And as soon as they were finished, we sat down to watch some TV. It was in the evening hours of the day when all the chaos started. Sirens began blaring all around us. We lived in Seattle all our lives, so we'd never really experienced anything like that before. My husband immediately recognized it as a tornado warning. And he told us all to get into the bathroom and close the door. Our house had no basement or shelter, so we had to make do with what we had. I never even considered tornadoes could be in our future. When we planned to move, our 6 of us huddled into the bathroom. We laid on top of one another to try and hold each other down just in case. My husband was on top shielding us with his body. The house started to shake, and our daughter started to cry and scream. Paula was grabbing onto me as tight as she could. Joss was trying to act brave, but I knew that he was terrified. The look in his eyes as he stared back, and he said it, all the sounds of windows breaking and debris flying had become louder and louder as the minutes passed. I was praying for my children's lives, for all our lives. This was not our time to die. I thought all I could think about as the ground shook underneath us was how they still had so much of the lives left to live. I wanted to see them grow, graduate high school and college, fall in love, get married, have a family of their own someday. I was terrified of the thought of that possibility not happening. After being in the bathroom for 10 minutes, we felt the house shake like nothing we'd felt before. The roof was torn off in seconds. And now all of us were screaming and terrified. My husband held on to us with all his strength as each gust of wind threatened to pull us up into God knows what, didn't take us who knows where. At this point I was terrified, crying and holding on to whatever piece of clothing or body part one could grab on to keep our kids safe underneath us and away from the danger that was looming above, screaming like a highway suddenly, and I felt Paula begin slipping out of my hold. I had started to scream her name to try and get my husband's attention. But when I looked over, there wasn't there. I grabbed on Apollo and managed to put her back underneath me. Not before she hit her head pretty hard against the wall from the wind pushing her. She went completely silent and was no longer crying. I knew something was wrong, but I just had to focus on the situation at hand and get her help. When the time came, I was worried about my husband. I hadn't even noticed that he'd been taken away by the storm. I prayed and prayed that he would be okay as I put the full weight of my body on my children's to keep them weighed down and out of harm's way. After what felt like eternity, the storm rolled on. And the wind finally slowed down and everything became silent. We've all gotten up out of our positions and I picked up Paula. She had been completely limp and I noticed blood trailing down the side of her head. And tears rolled down my face as I assumed the worst. At this point, I was thinking that I lost my husband and one of our children. We walked out of the bathroom and into the rubble that was once our home. I found my husband lying in the front yard, obviously thrown there by the wind. I could see him gasping for air as I rushed over to him. I held his head in my hands and I told him how much I loved him. And the first thing he asked between gasps was if the kids were okay. I told him Paula had gotten hurt and I could see the worry in his eyes. Thank God, we did get help soon after from the disaster relief team. We had no way of calling anyone and our cards had been thrown by the wind. So all we could do was wait until they showed up and found us. We were all taken to the hospital. And myself, Josh, Jamie, and April had minor cuts and bruises. But I'm so grateful to say that both my husband and Paula survived. Paula had extensive brain damage and still to this day requires around-the-clock care, which is incredibly sad for the circumstances. But I'm just thankful to God that she's still with us. My husband broke multiple bones throughout his body, but he did recover fully within about a year. We're just so thankful that they both survived. The whole incident was just so terrifying that we decided moving back to Seattle was our best option. Our families were there, and my husband got another job offer that he said was just as good. Our lives were forever changed that day, and we hope we never have to experience anything as terrifying as that ever again. Alright, I'll just start from the very beginning. I was around 12 years old when this happened, and 33 now, but thinking about what happened that night still gives me goosebumps. The context. I think I should mention that I grew up on a very large farm in the middle of nowhere in southern Idaho. It wasn't in the mountains, like you might be thinking. It was just grass and hills for miles. My mom and dad were both raised in big cities. So when they got married, they figured they'd give their kids more of a farm life to grow up in. And I always loved it. We had goats, chickens, ducks, turkeys, you name it, we had it. The only thing that didn't have was much more freedom from my parents. My dad was a goat farmer and his job was working on the farm. He sold goat milk, made cheese, and of course, sold the meat. My mom was just a stay-at-home mother. So she was also around all the time, which basically meant I had no alone time and no privacy. When I was little, I didn't mind much. I loved having my parents around. I helped my dad with the farm work and taking care of all the animals. And I was always in the kitchen baking and cooking with my mom. But by the time I reached middle school, I was ready to grow up and I guess, do what every kid does when they hit puberty. Just kind of pull away from your parents, I guess. It was hard and my parents hated it. I think that's because my brother was so much older than me and had already left the house. By that point, I was their little baby girl and they weren't quite ready for the teenager rebellious phase to hit yet. Every weekend, we would go out to dinner as a family, we would meet up with my brother and his girlfriend, and it was actually really fun. This night, though, I just wanted to stay home. My mom insisted that I go with them. And when I refused, she offered to stay with me so I wouldn't be alone. I begged and begged her to just let me stay there alone. And finally, after what felt like forever, she agreed. My dad wasn't happy about it. But she told him everything would be fine and fine. He did anything. I could just call that we're only going to be around a 45-minute drive to the city. And I was ecstatic. I felt like for the first time in my life I was free. That night, my mom and dad gave me a hug and a kiss and said their goodbyes. That gave me the rundown that all parents give when leaving their kids home alone for the first time, such as cell phone numbers, the restaurant they'd be at calling 911 for an emergency, etc., etc., et one in one ear and out the other. I was just looking forward to staying up late and watching shows I wasn't supposed to watch, you know, normal kid stuff. I should also mention that we had a German Shepherd named Ghost at the time. He was an all-white German Shepherd. And I always thought he looked more like a wolf. My parents got him when I was just a baby, and we grew up together. He was like my shadow. I'm sure having him around also gave my parents some peace of mind when leaving me that night. My mom and dad finally left at around 7 p.m. and I was excited. I heard my parents pull out of the driveway and I was on the couch and Seconds goes join me and we watched some TV for a while. About an hour went by and nothing of significance happened. I watched some stupid TV shows on MTV that my parents didn't normally allow and ate some candy that I'd saved up from Easter a couple of weeks before. An important thing to mention is we didn't have any curtains on any of our windows. We lived in the middle of nowhere and we weren't really worried about anyone seeing, and plus my mom loved the morning sun shining in through the windows without her having to go around the whole house opening them. After it had been around an hour and a half since my parents left, my mom called to tell me that they wouldn't be home when they had originally said because my brother and his girlfriend also wanted to see a movie with him that night. She told me she'd come home to be with me if being home alone longer made me uncomfortable. But honestly, I was super happy that I'd be getting a few extra hours of alone time, so I told her I'd be fine and to go enjoy the movie. During one of the show's commercial breaks, I rushed into the kitchen to get a bowl of ice cream. I heard Ghost starting to bark in the living room, then figured that he just saw one of the many bats that were flying around that time of night, so I thought nothing of it. Only this time he would not stop barking. It got so annoying that I remember yelling at him to stop, but he just wouldn't let up. I walked into the living room and couldn't help but scream when I saw what Ghost was barking at. There was a man standing there, right outside the window. He was wearing a white rubber Halloween mask that had a huge painted smile on the front. I couldn't see his eyes. But oh my god, he was insanely creepy. I froze in pure terror and looked at this man as he stared back at me. I felt tears rolling down my cheeks, and I guess my fight or flight kicked in, because before I knew it, I was screaming at Ghost, "Follow me," and running upstairs to my parents' bedroom. When I got to the top of the stairs, I just couldn't help myself. I looked back. I had to know if he was still there. He was. Only this time his hand was raised, and he waved slowly at me. His head tilted upward, so I was still in his view. I got into the bedroom and locked the door behind me. At this point, I was bawling. I totally regretted staying alone. And all I wanted was my mom and dad, and rushed over to the nightstand and picked up the landline to call my dad, but there was no dial tone. I wasn't too worried about it considering my father had given me a cell phone to use in emergencies. But the only problem was that it was in my room across the hall. And I didn't want to chance going back to where this masked man could see me. I had no other option though. I was not just going to wait around for my parents to come back hours later, with this man just feet from me outside the house. I mustered up every bit of courage I had, unlocked the bedroom door, and ran as fast as I could. And in the 10 seconds it took me to get to my room, I noticed the man was not outside the window anymore. The window was open, and he was now standing at the bottom of the stairs. I involuntarily screamed homeless as loud as I could, and heard his footsteps begin to run up the stairs after me. Ghosts began lunging toward the men barking, which made him hesitate for a moment. And this was long enough for me and Ghost to get into my room and lock the door behind me and grab the phone out of my drawer and dialed 911. Desperate for someone to get here as soon as possible. The man outside my door began trying to handle. I watched a jiggle as he tried to get into my room the whole time, never actually speaking a single word. And I think that's what terrified me even more. The operator answered and barely understood me through my hysteria. But she got the gist and told me that an officer was already in the area and would be there in only 5 minutes. She told me to stay on the line until he showed up, and something in me thought that I should loudly say, "Okay, so an officer will be here in 5 minutes. He'll be here in 5 minutes, right?" The second I spoke those words, all the jiggling and noises stopped, the handle stopped moving. And for all I knew, he had completely left the house. But God, my heart was racing. I knew I wasn't leaving that room until I was sure an officer was there to help me. And just like the operator said, an officer was at my house within that period of time. I saw the lights outside when he pulled up, and I did hear sirens. I heard them enter the house and run up the stairs, yelling for the man to get down to put his hands behind his back. This was just confirmation to me that the man hadn't left. And it was so glad that I hadn't tried to exit my room when I thought that they arrested him and one of them took them away while the other waited with me. I guess they had called my parents, who were rushing home. They ended up finding multiple slain goats on the property. They had very clearly been killed with stab wounds scattered across their bodies. When the police found him, he was still standing outside my door, just staring at it. Blood on his body. He never even looked at them when they came in. The man never did say why he did this. He actually never spoke at all. After this period of time, we did find out that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. To our relief, My mom and dad thought of selling the farm and buying another one after that traumatic event and potentially going to a state across the country where they thought he would never find us if he did eventually get out, whatever his motivations may have been. But the masked man ended up taking his own life in prison before that could ever happen. And to any child out there who wants freedom from their parents when they're still too young, just remember, in your scariest moments, they are the people you wish that were there the most. I'm a fairly cautious individual. I always told myself that I'd never be like other people who get themselves caught in dangerous situations. But that's exactly what happened. I'm a 28-year-old woman and I currently live with my husband Sam and our 3-year-old daughter Elena. My husband and I both grew up in the area, and when we got married, we decided a nice house on a lot of land would be perfect for us. We'd never been the city living type and we wanted our daughter to have a lot of space to play. Over the 5 years that we lived here, we've purchased a lot of farm animals off Craigslist. We started with chickens and then pigs and then eventually goats. Just over a year ago, I suggested to my husband that it would be fun to get a cow. We could milk her and she wouldn't have to have her calf taken away like most dairy cows. So we felt that we were doing a good thing. After about 6 months with her, we realized that she was just way too much work to take care of for her and her calf, and we wanted them to go to a home that had the time to take proper care of them. I was really sad about letting her go. But I also knew was the right thing to do. I suggested to my husband that we list her on Craigslist, and he agreed that it was a good idea. So I listed her immediately. We knew she would sell fast, given that she milked well and came with her calf. With only a few hours of listen. Then we got around 10 emails. We weeded out the scams, and one person stood out to us. They said that they had a 50-acre farm and other dairy cows. So they had experience. They also said that they could pick her up as soon as possible for the exact price that we were asking. We were so happy that they were going to go to such a good home. The only problem was my husband was going out of town for work the next week. He told me multiple times that he was not comfortable with a stranger coming to the farm when he wasn't going to be there. But I was a little too trusting and was positive it would be fine. The people in our area were good people, and I hadn't heard of anything bad coming from animal purchases in the area. The people who were coming told me that they were a husband and wife named John and Betty. In the moment, I did make a little joke to myself that their names were so boring that they almost sounded fake. But the thought passed and it didn't cross my mind again. I gave them our address and told them that they could come to pick up the cows the next day at around 4 p.m. That night, my husband gave my daughter in the UK a kiss and left for his work trip. My husband was very serious when it came to him leaving us alone. We had set times that we would call each other, and if I missed a call, he would alert the police. It may seem dramatic to some people, but it was our routine. And if it gave him more peace of mind when he left, then I was more than okay with it. The night came and went without incident. I woke up early at around 6 a.m. to let out all the animals to feed and give them water. They were also excited to be out for the day since it rained the day before and they had been cooped up inside. Elena always went out with me in the morning, and it was so cute seeing her interacting with all the animals. I let the cows out for what I thought would be the last time I rubbed their backs and essentially said my goodbyes. At around 1 p.m. I made Elena and myself something to eat and got her dressed in different clothes for the rest of the night. We then sat on the sofa and waited for 4 o'clock to come when the cows would be picked up. Throughout the day I'd done my routine calls with my husband, tell him how we were doing. And if I'm being completely honest, I totally regretted letting strangers come to the house without him being there. I started to have this really horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that I just couldn't shake. John and Betty called to tell me that they were only 5 minutes out. So I went out on the porch to greet them as they pulled up. I just put Elena down for her nap. So I was completely alone out there. The first thing I noticed when they pulled up was the masks that they were both wearing. I immediately began running back up the steps to my house before hearing one of them yell, "No, no, no, you get back here now. You get a very thick southern accent that was almost hard to understand. I felt something hard being pressed to my back, and I immediately knew it had to be a gun. I asked them with a shaky voice, what do they want, but I didn't have any cash. And they quickly told me to shut up, and if I wanted to live, I'd do exactly as they said. The woman Betty had a very raspy voice, almost like she'd smoked for 40 plus years. I could tell she was also from the South when she said that. You're going to go inside and get every piece of jewelry you own. Put it in the bag and give it straight to me while John here gets whatever he wants. And you won't put up a fight. The first thing I thought of was my daughter. I couldn't let them find Elena. I didn't know what these people were capable of. I told her I'd comply, but I already knew I wouldn't. I really couldn't. And I had to keep my daughter safe. And went inside my house very close behind me as I walked toward the bedroom. My husband kept the shock on under the bed, and I knew if I could just get to it, I might be able to save my daughter's life and possibly my own too. I keep my jewelry box under the bed. I need to get under there to grab it, okay? My voice was calm at that point because I was so worried that she was going to suspect something was up. Whatever. Just give him what I asked for, she said, and I could feel her spit landing on my face while she talked. She was missing most of her teeth, so I wasn't surprised, disgusted, but not surprised. I got on my hands and knees on the floor and peered under the bed. And there it was, only inches away. I knew I would have to be fast if I was going to get out of this without getting myself and my daughter killed. In one swift motion, I pulled out the gun. And boom. Without thinking or aiming, I fired a shot. The force of the blow made this Betty fly across the room, her chest completely demolished by the blast. And the smell of gunpowder lingered in the room, mixed with the scent of her blood splattered across the walls and on the floor as it oozed out of the large hole that I just put in her chest. She was gone within seconds. It was a double barrel. So I knew whenever John would come running in, I'd only have one chance to take him to. My adrenaline was pumping. I didn't even think of the person that had just died in my bedroom. And all I could think of was keeping my daughter safe. If I died in the process, so be it. John did come in the room yelling for Betty. But he took one look, and before I could get a shot off, he was running down the stairs and out the door screaming Jesus Christ, while his voice cracked seemingly out of sadness. I ran to get Elena and carried her with me to the front porch where we sat. The police showed up 30 minutes later, saying my husband had called and said something was wrong at the house. I hadn't called them at our scheduled time, so he knew something was up. And I could barely talk. I swear that I had gone into shock. I sat there with my daughter while the officers searched the house and found the body upstairs. And it turns out, of course, those names were fake. They were never able to identify the man, but the woman was someone that the officers knew well around the area. She'd been arrested multiple times on drug-related charges. That day was the worst, most traumatizing day of my life. But it taught me a very valuable lesson. Never assume strangers are worthy of your trust. And never underestimate a mother's love for a child.